Hello, and welcome to the session, Clearing Anti-CRT Smokescreens, Affirming Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Belonging, and Justice in Schools, School Districts, and Institutions of Higher Education. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Today, we're going to talk about a very important topic. Over the past year or more, political stakeholders have advanced censorship legislation with pointed focus on critical race theory. CRT legislation. The narratives and legislative campaigns created around this topic have disrupted the already fragile efforts to create diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice in public schools and institutions of higher education. To examine the educational landscape through the lens of CRT, related social and political implications, and best practices for political action and advocacy. Myself, Dr. Ivory Tolson, and Dr. White will engage in a candid conversation with University of Wisconsin-Madison's Professor Emeritus, Dr. Gloria Lansing-Billings, who is a founder and leading scholar of critical race theory in education. I want to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Lansing-Billings' background before we get started, because she is really a giant in the field. And aside from everything that you're going to hear me say about her professional accolades, she is a mentor to so many in the field and means so much to scholars across the nation as we grapple with all of these issues. Dr. Gloria Lansing-Billings is the former Kellner Family Distinguished Professor of Urban Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and faculty affiliate in the Department of Education Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is a fellow of the British Academy and American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Hagler Institute of Texas A&M University. She was the 2005 to 2006 president of the American Education Research Association, AERA. Dr. Lansing-Billings' research examines the pedagogical practice of teachers who are successful with African-American students. And she also investigates, of course, critical race theory applications in education. She is the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of African-American Children and Crossing Over to Canaan, the journey of new teachers of diverse classrooms, and numerous journal articles and book chapters. She is a former editor of the American Educational Research Journal and a member of several editorial boards. I can go on and on listing her many accolades, but it would take the entire time. But I do hope that you would go and do some investigation of Dr. Gloria Lansing-Billings' background on your own. At this point, before we get into our dialogue, I'd like to turn it over to my co-host, Dr. Ashley White, who is the NAACP Fellow, the inaugural NAACP Fellow for Equity, Access, and Opportunity in Education, a rising star in the field, who I'm honored to work with. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. White, so you can kick things off for us.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Tolson. And just have to add a note that it is really exciting to be able to have a conversation with two individuals who have mentored me throughout my professional journey. So just thank you to you both. I want to start by setting the stage by briefly discussing the state of censorship legislation to date. So we know it's no secret, in 2021, President Biden rescinded Executive Order 13950, which was entitled Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping, which barred any federal contractor or subcontractor from providing diversity-related programming. President Biden's rescinding of this executive order was a part of the administration's larger efforts to advance its own equity agenda through Executive Order 13985, which is advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. We also know that despite this federal declaration and others like it, censorship legislation efforts have continued to proliferate, with approximately 20 censorship laws passed to date. And currently there are two very large buckets of censorship legislation, one centered on constricting conversation, learning, and inclusion related to sex and gender, which largely affects students and other members of the LGBTQ and plus population, including teachers who are a part of this community. The other bucket is censorship legislation related to race, and this is rooted in attacks on critical race theory in large part through false narratives that create fear, and also a chilling effect for P through 12 educators who desire to teach, I wouldn't even say topics centered around race, but really just desire to do their jobs in a comprehensive way, to teach accurate history, to include relevant historical topics through other curriculum areas such as math, science, and reading, and really to prepare students not only from an academic perspective, but also to be the kinds of citizens that appreciate diversity, think more critically about the world, and challenge some of the very structures and practices in our society that really have created the issues we are facing today. Similarly, attacks on IHEs potentially restrict faculty and other instructors from teaching concepts that attend to the needs of historically marginalized students, families, and communities, impacting the quality of education that students in IHEs receive and limiting their exposure to cultural histories and considerations that make for comprehensive educational experiences. So here we are at the nexus of CRT and its role in current policy practice and research. And as we gain a better understanding of these issues and plausible solutions from you, Dr. Latson-Billings, I can't help but to reflect on the fact that you conceived of CRT in education decades ago and have been using it to frame educational issues in context for an equally long period of time. And so while it's not your first piece, in 1998, over 20 years ago, you wrote an article entitled, "Just What is CRT and What's It Doing in a Nice Field Like Education?" where you discussed the topics of today, but again, this was over 20 years ago. And so I'd like to start by asking if you could provide a bit of context surrounding your foresight in writing this article, and also from your lips and in this moment, define CRT and CRT in education for us.
So I'd like to start with the second question first, and that is, what is CRT? Because I think there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about what it is and what its purpose is. Its fundamental job is to ask the question, how do we explain racial disparity? Now, let's be clear. In this country, we've always had an explanation for racial disparity. From 1619 or earlier up to about the mid-20th century, our explanation was biogenetic. We literally said, this group of people is just not intelligent enough. They're not smart enough. They're not capable enough. And we so invested in that notion that our colleges and universities, mainstream or predominantly white colleges and universities, had departments and programs in eugenics. Some of the people who are foundational in education believe this. People like Lewis Terman, Elwood Cubberley, who was the first dean of Stanford, Shockley. I mean, we know all of these people as, quote, laudatory educators who believe that fundamentally Black people were not intellectually equal. Now, somewhere around the mid-20th century, you have the Brown decision where really thinking people are saying, well, that doesn't really fly. And so the explanation then sort of shifts to a notion of, well, they just don't have equal opportunity. That's not a bad explanation. But here's the problem with that explanation. Every time equal opportunity is, quote, granted, it gets rolled back. So you do have the Brown decision. But we now know that our schools are more segregated now than ever before. And we know the court cases that came post-Brown, things like Milliken or Rodriguez v. San Antonio v. Rodriguez or Dowell. I mean, these cases just get piled on that essentially said we don't have to have stopped school segregation. Affirmative action, it will come up in the courts in October in the new term. So every time equal opportunity is out there, it gets rolled back. Voting rights. So yes, we do provide these opportunities, but we continue to roll them back. The question that I have as a quote scholar is, well, how do you explain the disparity? Well, it turns out that critical race theory essentially says this is sort of baked into the system that we now have, that it's normal, it's not aberrant, it's not something that just happens episodically. It happens over and over and over again. So what I say to people all the time, critical race theory is not my religion. It's the best explanation that I have for understanding racial disparity. If you give me a better explanation, then I'm probably going to move to that. But right now, this is what I have at hand. How did I end up writing about it in education? I want to be clear, I'm not the first person to write about it in education. I think the first article that I come across goes back to 1980. So we're now talking some 42 years ago. And it comes out of a symposium that Derek Bell gave in 1978 on the celebration of the 25th anniversary of Brown. And he wrote an article called Brown and the Interest Convergence Dilemma. And one of the tenets of critical race theory is interest convergence. The notion that the only way that Black people are able to move forward is if they can get their interests to converge with those of whites. That, in other words, that most civil rights legislation has to show a benefit to whites for it to make it through the legislative process. So I'm not so sure I discovered it. I'm not so sure I founded it. I think I uncovered it and brought it to light to a new audience, and that is education researchers.
So can you talk a little bit more about how you have used this theory in your work, and how the intent of the theory compares to the current narrative for anti-CRT legislation?
So the bulk of my work is really in teaching. It's bringing about another generation of scholars. They need a theoretical framework from which to make sense of the research. One of the knocks against education research is that it's atheoretical. People just pull data together and make a statement. You need a theory to ground your work. And so there's all kinds of theories. There's reproduction theory, there is positive functionalist theory, there is interpretivist theory. So here's a theory that places race at the center. It's one of the things that I found quite attractive, because our tendency is to lump everything together. And really, critical race theory grows out of some discontent in the legal profession around the way in which the law doesn't, or legal scholarship doesn't address inequality. So there was a gathering of legal scholars here at Wisconsin back in the late 70s, early 80s, called the Critical Legal Study, CLS. Because they felt like race and gender and class were marginalized in the discussion of legal theory. Well, even there, scholars of color said, yeah, but you're still not attending to how race is specifically outlined in our profession. That if you look at things like inequality around criminal justice or housing, you think about redlining or employment, they almost always break down along racial lines. So critical race theory emerges out of the discontent of folks who were doing critical legal studies. In my own work, I'm trying to get my students to understand that, number one, I don't want them to operate atheoretically. And so They don't have to use critical race theory. In fact, unless they do the study, I discourage them from doing it because I said, if you don't really understand it, you shouldn't be using it. But I would say that what we are seeing today, you have the disadvantage of having a former history teacher in this interview. And so I always like to look over the long view. And history is not just a diachronic listing that this happened and then this happened and this happened. It's also synchronic. In other words, things happen at the same time. So think about it. You have the former president, Donald J. Trump, in September of 2020, declaring that there will be no federal contracts awarded to people that do any work on anti-racism or certain, and he specifically names critical race theory. 2020, September. Well, what else is happening? He is in the midst of a presidential election, and he's not faring well. So in some ways, critical race theory is the attempt to turn the gaze from failed policies, from a major pandemic that really is not being well addressed. And so if we can rile, and we know we can rile, the US gets riled up around issues of race. The problem with what has happened is that in many ways it is shackling the ability of so many teachers to help students make sense of the world in which they exist. I actually read an article today in which teacher said her students are concerned about what happened in Buffalo with the shooting of those people in the Tops grocery store. And she doesn't know how to teach it without talking about race. And she's prohibited, she believes, from even mentioning race. So I think it's the anti-CRT movement has, number one, it's conflated every discussion about race as critical race theory, which it is not. Something like the 1619 curriculum is not a CRT curriculum. It's a historical and journalistic attempt to look at the way that slavery has helped shape the way we see our world. It's not a critical race theory document. But one of the things that happened with Christopher Rufo out of the Manhattan Institute, and he says this in his own Twitter feed, that, we're just going to take all of the ideas that are, quote, unpopular with Americans. Now, I have a lot of trouble with that. I was also an English minor. So what constitutes popularity? And number two, who are the Americans? But he says, we're going to take all the ideas that are unpopular with Americans and brand them with the term critical race theory as a way to render the phrase toxic. So anything that people don't like. And so I'm just shocked at, social emotional learning is now critical race theory. Culturally responsive teaching is now critical race theory. Anything that people who have a kind of rightist extremist viewpoint don't like is now critical race theory. I think one of the saddest political cartoons I saw was after a school shooting, you see the police officer coming out of the building, their bodies everywhere, and the police officer comes out of the building and says, oh, don't worry, no critical race theory was being taught here. As if that is the most serious thing that we have to deal with.
Thank you. So for my last question for this segment, can you just talk a bit, and you've discussed this as we've been talking thus far, but just on a grander scale, how do you think CRT in your work has contributed to educational advancement for the field, which again, you've discussed quite in depth, but also including educational practices? So while we know that CRT is not something that is taught in P through 12, how do you think it has worked to help progress toward equitable educational experiences and outcomes for students P through 20?
Well, I think its goal is to provide an analytic tool. How do you make sense of year after year after year of student of racial disparity with students in academics, whether it's literacy or mathematics, whether it is college going or graduation rates, whether it's disciplinary practices. It gives you a kind of frame to say, okay, this seems to be happening. And I think it's helpful for practitioners, particularly educational leaders. You know, the question is not that, do I have only bad Black kids, you know, which you could maybe read the data that way, or is something happening in my school that systematically excludes Black children from success, from being able to stay in the classroom as opposed to experiencing suspension or expulsion. So again, it can be a framework for them. The idea that there's something that you just go in and teach doesn't make sense. I mean, I would no more teach quantum physics to kindergartners. I don't have to teach kindergartners gravity for gravity to be happening, right? I don't have to teach the concept. If you throw something up, it's going to fall down. Now, until you come to me and say, why is it falling down? I don't have to say anything about gravity. What I find really interesting, however, about these, all this, what I would call posturing in legislatures, is that the one thing that these people obviously don't have any understanding of is adolescent development. Because the one thing you do if you want adolescents to do something is you tell them not to do it. So what's happening? Young people across this country are looking up information on critical race theory. I have gotten more emails from, allegedly, because you never know who's behind the screen, but high schoolers saying, can you tell me what this critical race theory is? Now, I actually don't answer those questions because I don't know. I don't want to talk with the minors, and I don't want to hear people saying, oh, she's indoctrinating our kids. But I will say to them, this is something that you certainly can research on your own. Here are some books you might want to look at. I give them some suggestions, but I don't have the ongoing conversation with them. So I think it's really interesting that in some ways it's backfiring. Before September 2022, I was compiling a collection of writing on critical race theory for Teachers College Press. And I said to them, I don't think this is going to sell. This is so esoteric. Nobody's interested in this topic. Well, at this point, I feel like Allen Iverson, you know, my haters are making me great. Literally, this book is flying off the shelves because now people want to know. But I think it's really, you know, it's really not about someone like me who is in some ways immune to the critique. I worry about our teachers. I worry about that teacher in Iowa, that teacher in Texas, that teacher in Florida, who may lose a job because they're trying to teach the truth.
Thank you, Dr. Latson-Billings, for that insightful commentary. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Dr. Ivory Toldson, and he will lead us further in this discussion.
Okay, thank you all so much. And that was a great segue into what I want to talk about, because we recently did a survey. We funded a survey and participated in the development of a survey looking at CRT messaging and really trying to understand how CRT was landing with the general public. And it's been interesting coming from the field of academia, being in the ivory tower of sorts, and coming to an organization like the NAACP, because there's a lot more intentionality about looking at people outside of academia and the general public and how they are feeling and perceiving different things. So there's quite a few findings, but I picked some of them out because I wanted to get your reaction and insight to them. So I'm gonna share my screen right now. Okay, so do you all see the slide?
Yes.
That's on the screen? Okay. So just by way of background, we got survey results from about 1,600 people, individuals. These were all adults. We use a variety of mediums to collect the information. They were collected in multiple languages. And there was an equal distribution among the major racial groups in the United States. So in terms of how people feel, whether it's favorable or unfavorable about different topics, it's clear that there are some topics that is more favorable than others, and there's huge differences across races. And there's also topics that the general public knows more about than others. So in terms of Black Lives Matter, just about everybody knows what Black Lives Matter is, or at least they feel like they know what it is. And generally, it's something that is very favorable to Black people, 77%. And among our white Americans, they're the only group where the majority of them do not find it favorable, but it's still around 49% finds it favorable. Now, something like multiracial democracy, we see a lot more in that don't know category. So you see at the bottom of that, there are people who look favorably on the term multiracial democracy, but a lot of people just don't know about it. So in terms of critical race theory, and comparing that to affirmative action, I know they are two completely different things, but we mostly want to know what people knew about, how they felt about it, and whether or not they are favorable towards it. So most people know what affirmative action is, and again, with Black people, the majority of Black people look at affirmative action favorably. Now, with critical race theory, there's a lot more in that don't know category. So there's still a lot of people in the general public, not the plurality, but a lot of people in the general public don't know what critical race theory is. And among the ones that do, you can see that there is favorability among Black people, but total across the board, when we look at all of them combined, we still have this unfavorable opinion. And that's mostly because of what Dr. Lansing Billings discussed. There's been a coordinated effort in order to demonize critical race theory. In terms of some of the partisan differences, we see that, because this has been introduced in politics, we see these huge political differences in how people feel about it. So the majority of Democrats across all races, the ones that know what critical race theory is, they look at critical race theory as being favorable, and non-Democrats, and could be Republicans or independents, but non-Democrats are more likely to have that unfavorable view. Now, in terms of discussions of race and racism, as you see, the overwhelming majority of Black people feel like the problem of racism and discrimination is something that is serious, 87%, nearly 90%. We also see among white adults, the majority of them do not think that racism and discrimination against them is serious. And I think the way that this is worded, it asks about your own group. So we probably would expect it to be that way. Now, interesting, when we look at how comfortable the participants were in having discussions about race, 80% of white people, 88% of Black people say that they're comfortable discussing race. I think that although most people are comfortable discussing race, there appears to be certain topics about race that is taboo to certain groups. Now, one interesting thing in the survey, and I didn't put the slides up, but the co-opted message of Martin Luther King, where Martin Luther King Jr., where certain people of a certain political ilk has been intentional about saying that Martin Luther King's message was that everyone should be created or should be treated equally regardless of their race. And it shouldn't be about your race, but the content of your character, not the color of your skin or the content of your character. Now we know what Martin Luther King was saying, and we know the full context of that, and we know his full history and legacy. But it does seem to be a way for white people certain types of white people to act like they're talking about race, but ignore race at the same time. So finally, and this is something that I really wanted your opinion on, but when it comes to who people think should have the most say when deciding how race and history is taught in public schools in their area, the majority said parents. And coming in second is the state's Department of Education, third, your local school board, fourth, your governor or state legislature, and that's where the numbers really take a dive. And then local teachers in your area is right down there with our elected officials and then people in the neighborhood. Now, when we think about how the anti-CRT rhetoric has been framed, it's been very much around parents' rights. But this really calls into the question, what parents are you targeting? And so there's a lot of dog whistling going on. They're saying that parents should be scared about what their children are learning in school. But it's clear they're not talking to or about those Black parents that were represented in this survey. And then when we look at teachers, there's also this marginalization of teachers through this process. And in many cases, pitting parents against teachers, which of course is not good for the field. So this is a snapshot of some of the findings that I thought was pertinent to this conversation. And I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen now and open back up this dialogue. So the NAACP works with over 2,200 units across the nation. These are state conferences, local units, college chapters, youth leagues, and all of our units have education chairs. And we also have activists and advocates that are on the ground as grappling with these issues and trying to sway opinion so that our learners have the best opportunity. So given some of these results and our ability to help advocate these things, just want to know your insight, your reaction to these results, and how you might use information like this to help advocates to advance equity in schools.
Well, let me just say a couple things popped in my mind as I looked at your data. For example, on the first slide, that who knew about and had favorable perceptions of Black Lives Matter, those figures map almost precisely onto the voting patterns of the 2008 election of Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Because when people say, oh, we're now this, racism is not an issue. It turns out that no, Black people overwhelmingly voted for him. And the majority of people of color also voted for him. But white people still voted mostly for McLean Palin. So that part hasn't changed. But I'm also struck by a recent NPR Ipsos poll that asked questions about how people felt about how their schools were, quote, doing post-COVID. 76% of parents said, oh, my schools, they're doing a great job, given all they've been through, they're doing it. But 74% said that they were pleased that their schools do talk about race and wish that they would talk even more about it. So I think what has happened in the midst of this discussion is that a very well-organized, well-funded, vocal minority has been able to claim most of the airspace with this misinformation and disinformation. And I think the frustrating part is that some of our, major civil rights organizations, NAACP, Urban League, have kind of taken a back seat. They have not stepped up. I know that when I've talked to some of the stalwarts in the Democratic Party in the Black Caucus, they don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole because they feel as if, that train's left the station and we can only be painted with a negative brush if we jump in this conversation. But this is a fight that I just don't think we can avoid. I think we have to participate in it for two reasons. I know you're focused on PK-12 right now, but I'm saying number one reason is an academic freedom one at the university level. Scholars have to be able to study what they want to study, even unpopular topics. Marx has always been taught, we've taught about what is communism, what is socialism. That's always been taught at the university. But number two, and more pertinent to the work of folks in PK-12, is that this is really a civil rights issue.
Right.
So think about some of the testimony and statements that have been made in state legislatures about not wanting to teach something that makes students feel bad about their race. Seriously? Where were you people in the 1950s and the 60s when I was sitting in the classroom?
Right.
Because I did feel bad about Mark Twain's prolific use of the N-word in Huckleberry Finn. I wouldn't ban Huckleberry Finn. I would certainly continue to teach it and talk about the context in which this was an okay thing for him to write. But I would not expect that Black children would feel good about that. I didn't feel good about reading Gone with the Wind or Robinson Crusoe or any of these so-called classics, and I wouldn't ban any of them.
Yeah.
But I would place them in a context. Even something as, negative about Black culture as Conrad's Heart of Darkness, I still would teach it, but I probably would teach it alongside of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart.
Right.
Being educated is not about being made to feel comfortable. Being educated in a democracy is being able to grapple with tough ideas.
Right.
To be able to put forth an argument and to be able to participate in a deliberative discussion about evidence and facts and theories. That's what an educated society does. What an authoritarian or totalitarian society does is say, you can't read this. We're going to burn this book. We're going to ban this. And so to see this happening in the United States in 2022 is so disheartening because it's so anti-democratic. We're not even talking about anti-Black, it's anti-democratic to be doing this kind of censorship and demonization of people for having a different opinion.
Yeah, you brought up so many good points and ideas, and I've been taking notes and want to go through some of them. By talking about the legislation that's passed and just reading the text of it, I had the same feeling that you had. Like this is stuff that's been affecting Black people for all this time. Teaching accurate history. Now you're saying you want to teach an accurate history when you were telling me that Columbus discovered America. You didn't tell me that Columbus never made it to the mainland and that he committed genocide on the native population of what we now call Dominican Republic. You didn't tell us that. You told us that he discovered America.
Or you didn't tell historians.
Right.
Frederick Jackson Turner thesis, and I can claim Frederick Jackson Turner because he was a Wisconsin historian.
Yeah.
Is wrong. We've built an entire curriculum PK-12 on Jackson's notion that democracy was tied to moving out, moving westward to the frontier thesis, and that indeed that that frontier was uninhabited, that it was untamed, and it was uncivilized. So here I am sitting in Wisconsin, in a place that has 12 tribes, bands, and federations who have always been here. But according to Frederick Jackson Turner, no, they weren't. So yeah, the inaccuracies, and let's be clear, every society has a narrative that makes them look good. We're not unique in that way. But one of the ways that I think we try to be unique is to argue that democracy and the search for truth is something that we value. And so as we try to do that in the face of all of this pushback against the truth, I think it's just, it's amazing. It's just hard really to get our minds around.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also talked about the aspect of just about every one of those pieces of legislation where they say you can't make someone feel bad about aspects of their history or what their ancestors did. But we generally teach that in order to rehabilitate, in order to do better in the future, you have to have some level of remorse.
Yes.
And so if you don't feel bad about it, like if you're telling them that atrocities were committed, but you shouldn't feel bad about that, then you're not creating better citizens of the future.
Right.
You're creating people who are emotionally impoverished.
Exactly.
Who's at risk of continuing oppressive actions. So the short-sightedness of it, and just the absurdity of it is just really disheartening.
Well, and it's also it also doesn't get at the fact that many of these legislatures have not really done any deep thinking about what they are proposing. The thing that makes me laugh is that many of these state legislatures in which my name has been dragged, I actually have statements of resolutions off of their legislative floors applauding me. I have keys to some of their cities. I was just honored by one of these governors' honor guard. So it's like, it has nothing to do with the actual teaching of truth. It is, for me, it's really about this fall election and the 2024 election, that what can we do to get people riled up? If you cannot win on policy, then what you do is you start a culture war. And expect to win on that.
Yeah. And I was on a call with the education committee in Mississippi, and they were battling their legislature who was passing anti-CRT legislation that they didn't have the votes to stop. But the education chair there said that in session they talked about how you can't teach, this law is going to make it against the law to teach critical race theory in schools. And so someone said, well, there's only one class in the entire state of Mississippi on critical race theory. And that's at the University of Mississippi's law school. So does this law make it illegal for the University of Mississippi's law school to have this class? And the sponsors of it just said, well, they could do what they want. And
but I wonder, I've been to the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson. So my question there is, can you take the kids to that museum? Because they're going to see some stuff. They're going to see all of those, the documented lynchings. Mississippi's civil rights history is bloody, it is brutal, it is violent. And how are you going to explain it? Is it that just that many bad people in Mississippi? Is that what you're going to argue? Or are you going to be able to help students to see that a system was in place that made it impossible for
Yeah.
people to live out their full humanity.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to talk about something that's really serious to our organization, and that's what we're supposed to be doing, because there is a perception that the NAACP is not doing enough, and I certainly understand that. We are a decentralized organization, and we have state conferences across the United States. And there's a level of autonomy with those state conferences that's probably greater than your average organization. So we'll talk to a lot of the state conferences. Some of them, like in Indiana, their state conference was very instrumental in mobilizing a coalition of advocates, local advocates, to stop anti-critical race theory legislation in that state. And they became the only state are the only Republican-led state to kill the legislation. But at the same time, our local units are asking more of the national office. And I think outside of the NAACP, the Black population is looking at the NAACP as a whole, and asking us to do more. And I understand all of that, but still trying to get my arms around it. Trying to figure out what's the best way to support Black people in general and our units specifically on how to deal with this spate of legislation that's come down, and everyone who's trying their best to protect the efforts that had been gaining some momentum and had a boost over 2020 to create a more equitable, just learning environment for our children. So give us some of your thoughts and ideas about how a civil rights organization could do more in this space.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, people are fighting really at the local level. Our firewall here in Wisconsin is a Democratic governor who used to be the superintendent of public instruction. So he gets education, and so right now he's able to exercise a veto. But perhaps in the fall there may be a veto-proof legislation if they're able to flip a few more seats. But I think of two things that the NAACP as a national organization can do to help support its local units. Number one, I think about sort of quick and readable information about what critical race theory is or isn't. I mean, even something colorful. We know people don't read policy briefs. They don't read policy, number one, and then they don't read the briefs, which are designed to be even concise. But even something like, I don't know, a bookmark, a placard, a poster that says what critical race theory is and isn't, that gives sort of the important talking points. But I think a second, longer range and better strategy is probably what the Anti-Defamation League has done. And that is the development of its own curriculum around things like the Holocaust. I mean, I can remember working with teachers and them saying, oh, I could actually teach this way, where it's very specific about how to make sense of a contentious or controversial issue. I did a webinar for Stanford last year, and the question was, well, what would you teach, 1619 or the 1776, which Donald Trump commissioned?
Right.
I said, I'd have both of them, because students have to be able to make sense of them. You have to ask, well, why is this particular information left out? Or why is this particular information lifted up? That's our job, I think, as educators, is to really get students to raise these central questions. So again, something very convenient for people to be able to talk back to, And that form, it's all kinds of technologies that give you that form today. But the second one would be really helping to plan a curriculum that raises the issue, particularly in those places where teachers are still able to teach. I mean, there's certainly going to be some places where people are going to say, no, we can't include that. But I think in places that teach African-American history, in places that teach ethnic studies, I have a son who is a teacher who teaches an African-American history class in California. And one of the reasons he won't let them make it a part of the required curriculum, he said, because they're going to turn it into standards and things that I can and cannot do. I like the degrees of freedom that I now have. So I think providing, and when I say a curriculum, it doesn't necessarily have to end up in K-12. These local units can be teaching this as a community-based activity. There's nothing keeping a local NAACP from offering a 5-week course, right? That we're really just going to go through these things. So I think we have to have the information available to people so that they have something to speak back to.
Yeah, those are very good insights. And we do expect some resolutions to be passed at our next convention on how we deal with this anti-critical race theory and censorship legislation. So we'll be planning out our strategies over the next year to respond to those resolutions, and we're certainly going to keep these two things in mind. There was another finding, and one of the things that you mentioned made me think of this. And when you talked about 74% want to talk about race, one of the other things in the findings, it had different statements about people's attitude about race and racism and the purpose of talking about it. And they position the statements in around some of the things that we hear often in this debate. And one thing that was illuminating to me is that generally across the public, when you frame it in terms of us versus them, and even if you're on their side, so things related to the accusation that, and it's more than an accusation, but the observation that anti-CRT is a distraction that legislators are using to try to manipulate the public to drive votes to their agenda. So even though that's true, saying that doesn't land very well with the public. It doesn't necessarily bring people to your side. What seems to bring people together on this topic is when you talk about unity and harmony, and a lot of things that you really don't want to talk about when you're fighting, right? Because I mean, there are people who are pissing us off. They're pissing me off, and so I like to vent, but the average person that has their child in school and wants their child to have the best experiences in school, the message that they want most is that this is our pathway to creating harmony among the races and having a society where everyone gets along, understands each other, can work collaboratively, and we won't have the burden of racism getting in the way of us having happy and productive lives together. So that's the message that the general public wants to hear. So want to get your reactions to that, your thoughts about that, and if that should be considered when we try to position ourselves in this debate that we didn't start.
Well, one of the things you left out of what it is that they want in terms of this harmony and unity and everybody getting along. I want all of this, but I don't want to give up a thing that I currently have.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want it to hit my pocketbook. I don't want it to come into my neighborhood. I don't want it to change my kids' chances of getting into an elite college. Right. The concept that I've been really working with, I'm trying to get this book finished on, is the concept of justice. And I've been very, very deliberate in saying I'm not talking about social justice, because social justice has become concept non grata, right? It's the proxy for, oh, you just want to do this soft, frilly thing, and we want our kids to learn mathematics. You want to indoctrinate our kids about race and racism and gender equity. We just want our kids to learn how to read. But justice, just justice, and I think that's actually the name of the book, Justice, Just Justice, is a fundamental concept of this society. Social justice is not in the Constitution, but justice is. Justice is something that if you tell me you don't want justice, then you've already told me everything I need to know about you. When George Floyd was laying on that ground with Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck, he did not need social justice. He needed justice.
Just
when Ahmaud Arbery was being chased by those people, he did not need social justice. He needed justice. When Breonna Taylor's house door was being torn down, she did not need social justice. So I'm trying to get us back to a fundamental concept of justice. And then what does justice look like for, when we look at incarceration? What does it look like in housing? What is it? Can we get some agreement about what justice might look like in basic social services and benefits? It's interesting to me that, we talked a little bit about, people wanting their kids to know more about race, but there was a study done some years ago out of the University of Texas at Austin, and it was done in the Austin area. And I tell you that because, college towns often exist in a bubble of, quote, liberalism. They were asking the participants to, how do you want to talk, do you want to talk about race with your kid? Yes, we definitely do. And they divided them into 3 groups. So one group, they said, here's a video that introduces concepts of race. And it's like almost like a Sesame Street thing. Show your kids the video so that they can see this. The second group, they said, here are some books, children's books, at the level of your kids about race. Have your kids read the books. The third group, they said, talk to your kids about race. The people in the first 2 groups, the video and the books, follow through with no problem. The people in the talk to your kids about race, they just like, well, we just couldn't bring it up. It's just not something we could talk about. So that to me explains why they want schools to do it. It's just like, I can't broach this subject.
Right.
So I think there's probably enough trust in among teachers that parents indeed are willing to have teachers talk about it. But I don't know that the general public knows how to even have this conversation. We do a campus read here at Wisconsin every year. And I remember the year that the book was Just Mercy with Brian Stevenson. You couldn't get a seat in the auditorium. I ended up in an overflow place because so many people want to hear the stories. But do they want to understand their complicity You know, when you vote for someone who says, you know, 3 strikes and you're out, we got to get tough on crime, that these people don't deserve to see daylight. Do you understand what that really means? You understand that a jury of one's peers is a very subjective concept. So I think it is very, very interesting that on the one hand, we're saying certain things, but I'm not sure we have a robust understanding of justice. And if you think of the NAACP as a, you know, historical and ongoing organization that has fought for justice, that pushes the NAACP to the front of this fight, in my mind, that we cannot, as an organization, and I'm a life member of the NAACP, got a big old plaque on my wall and everything. So I'm gonna be clear. We can't keep pretending like this is something happening over there. No, it's happening right here. People need tools, they need support, they need all kinds of things. You know, the NAACP has been, you know, famous for its legal strategies. But it actually is going to have to drill down into, I think, education in a different way, and not just wait for the courts to settle things. You know, one of the issues that we have with the courts is between George Bush and Donald Trump, I think we have over 250, and Mitch McConnell, of course, over 250 federal judges that were appointed by Republicans. Those are lifetime appointments. You know, and we already see what this current Supreme Court is all about. So we have to back up to state houses. We cannot count on the federal government because we just don't have the numbers at that level. You know, unless you can get your case heard in DC or San Francisco, you're probably not going to win. You know, so I just think education is the place that the NAACP has got to plant deeper seeds to make some change.
Okay, well, as a director of education for the NAACP, I'm taking your tall orders. We're up for the challenge. Well, this has been a very illuminating conversation, and I just really appreciate everything that you've shared with us today, all of your insight, but more importantly, your lifetime achievements in this area, and for really setting the stage decades ago for the kind of conversation and advocacy that we can have right now. So to have you here with us right now is a treasure. Having your voice at our convention is going to be invaluable. Before we wrap things up, I just want to give you the opportunity to give any closing remarks that you would like to say, anything that we didn't ask you that you wanted to share, or anything you would like our 2 million plus members and supporters to know.
Well, I would just say, first of all, thank you for the invitation, but you know, you're a data guru. And one of the things that I love about looking at all the data that you have been able to collect for us is that it often tells the story in ways that I think people are so unaware. What happens to our young people in our schools, what is happening in communities, how we experience COVID versus how other groups experience COVID. All of that is right there in the data. And I think that the work of the NAACP, I think a lot of people don't understand, is around this whole notion of justice. This is not just for Black people. You know, I think people get thrown because we started out as an organization that was really fighting racism, but it's racism and discrimination. The gender issues are as important to the NAACP as the race issues. The disability issues are as important to the NAACP as the race issues. And to the degree that we help people understand that we are fighting for democratic principles, no matter where they are. You know, sometimes even the NAACP takes up causes that are unpopular with, quote, Black folks, but they are the right causes. So I'm delighted to be there. I hope that your membership will be energized around these issues, that they will get engaged at their local level. People start running for school board and state houses, because this is where it all starts. It's not just the national level that we are having this fight. We're having this fight in our own neighborhoods.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we can wrap up here. And if you want to know more information about what the NAACP is doing in education, you can go to our website, naacp.org. Also want to give Dr. White just an opportunity to say anything that you want to say before we close out. You can actually be the last voice that they hear from. Go ahead and close us out.
I'm glad that we have professional editors, because I'm thinking, okay, I want to make sure this is in an appropriate order. But I just want to thank you again, Dr. Latson-Billings. Just on a personal note, I know that I harangue you frequently, text you and call you, and I just really appreciate that, and just helping me to aid the director for the NAACP in doing our best work as a collective. Also just want to say thank you. I think this conversation as a whole has reminded us exactly of what the context of this is, right? And where this is actually rooted. And the point has been made over and over again in this session that this isn't really about CRT, right? And that this is about politics. And I have just one short story. So when you mentioned Heart of Darkness and Things Fall Apart, I read those in the 11th grade during the same year. And I was in a class with majority white kids. Now, granted, it was a specialized magnet program, so we can talk about curriculum later, right? And the ways that we cap marginalized students off from accessing that curriculum, but not once. And it was taught by white teachers, Black teachers. There were 3 11th grade English classes. And this was a standard, right, for this program. And I remember sitting in class with majority white students, and I can remember to this day the conversations that ensued and the way that our teachers engaged with us, right? To your point about gravity, it just is. And if you give students the space to have that conversation, they don't even really need us as educators, right? And so I just remember there not being this conversation around can we or can we not? It was embedded in the curriculum. It had been a standard, it had been a practice, and it was good for us, right? And that was in the 90s. And so your point about how this is tied to elections and politics really hits home for me, because if it wasn't, would we even be having this conversation? Right. And the other part of this is that when I hear you say that we can really drill down for the NAACP when it relates to education, what I hear you saying is that the education that we can do because of the legacy that NAACP has can expand beyond P through 12 and institutions of higher education and into our communities. And so thank you for lifting that up.
Sure.
Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot.
All right. See you next time.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.